Frank Fritz, a famous face from American Pickers, used to travel across America looking for lost treasures. He died suddenly of what the media called an unusual but unfortunate stroke. But when toxicology reports showed traces of poison and the FBI got involved, things started to fall apart. Mike Wolfe, Fritz's partner of over 10 years, is now being charged with first-degree murder. Then, in a surprise move, he doesn't fully deny the accusation. Instead, he points the finger at Rick Harrison, the porn king of porn stars. Why is Rick being linked to this case? Is Rick part of a plan to kill Frank and take over a TV empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars? Is Mike Wolfe really the killer? Or is he just a pawn pushed to the edge in a power struggle colder than any scripted drama? If you think you know the familiar faces on TV, think again, because what's about to happen is when Frank Fritz's death was first reported in early 2021. It was said that complications from a stroke were to blame. According to medical records from the Iowa State Hospital where Frank was last admitted, he arrived unconscious and showing sudden symptoms like disorientation, respiratory distress, and an irregular heartbeat. Paramedic reports said he was found on his kitchen floor unconscious for at least an hour with no signs of external trauma. These signs point to a cerebrovascular accident, especially for someone like Frank Fritz, who had a history of obesity, high blood pressure, and alcoholism. However, his family and close friends quickly raised doubts. Frank's cousin Jeff Fritz told local media that Frank's health had gotten a lot better in the last 6 months of 2020. He was eating well, working out, and not drinking. No one in his family thought he would die so suddenly. At the time, Mike Wolfe, who was still seen as Frank's best friend, the first person to post about Frank's death on social media, saying, "Frank was part of the soul of American Pickers. I've lost my closest brother." But from that point on, things started to go wrong. Investigators became interested in certain details from Frank's last days, like the dinner he had with Mike Wolfe and some old friends the night before he was taken to the hospital. One of the guests' longtime friend Susan T. said Frank looked tired after eating and complained of feeling dizzy and sick, but insisted on going home alone. "I thought maybe his blood pressure had dropped. He's had that before, but this time he looked worse than usual." These seemingly small comments changed the course of the case in a big way. 10 days after Frank died, the Iowa State Forensics Lab released its official toxicology report. That's when everything came together. In a 14-page document, they found that Frank's blood and stomach had abnormally high levels of benzodiazepines and drugs that slowed down the central nervous system. Since these substances weren't on any of Frank's prescriptions and didn't fit with a diagnosis of stroke, it was clear that he had been poisoned. When the report got to the Federal Bureau of Investigation (FBI), they put together a special task force to look into it. The first group of people they questioned were friends, family, and coworkers who had been with Frank in the last 2 weeks of his life. Naturally, Mike Wolfe, who had been seeing Frank, was one of them. Frank regularly, and was at that last dinner, was immediately put under surveillance. That's when the disturbing things started to come out. When police searched Frank's home in Davenport, Iowa, they found several medicine bottles with labels that had been tampered with or changed. Some of these bottles contained traces of toxins that were identical to those found in Frank's body. What's more, forensic analysis confirmed that Mike Wolfe's fingerprints were on 2 of those bottles. When asked about it, Wolfe admitted to having tampered. Mike said he helped Frank organize his medications after Frank hurt his back, but the time, place, and medications didn't match up. This turned suspicion into a quiet but solid accusation, and it didn't stop there. Indirect evidence started to pile up. Surveillance footage from Frank's neighborhood showed Mike entering Frank's house the night before the incident, which he hadn't said in his first police statement. Also, a voice message from Frank to a close friend revealed there was a recording of Frank saying, "Mike's been acting weird lately. He keeps pressuring me to quit the show and hand over full production rights. I'm not sure if he means well." Mike Wolfe, who had been Frank's partner for almost 15 years, was now at the center of a murder plot. When Mike was officially called to testify before a grand jury, he changed his story. He denied having anything to do with Frank's death and said the real person behind it was Rick Harrison, the host of Porn Stars, was involved in everything. Why bring him into it? It wasn't by accident. Rick Harrison, who you may know from History Channel's World of Antique Auctions, had business ties with both Mike and Frank. He never appeared in public with them, but he did fund joint branding ventures between their franchises. As we'll see in the next chapters, Rick Harrison wasn't just an outsider. He was a key link in a profit chain that being around Frank could be dangerous. Frank Fritz's poisoning is no longer a medical question. It's a criminal case with a motive, a method, and physical evidence. While Frank's family fights to clear his name, the public now looks at these once-loved TV personalities with a whole new set of eyes. Is Mike Wolfe a cold-blooded killer or just a pawn sacrificed in a much bigger game? If Rick Harrison is involved, what was his main goal in all of this? People who were connected to Frank Fritz's death were once admired across America. This case doesn't just hurt public trust in those TV-friendly faces. It also shows a harsh truth. Behind the bright lights of reality TV is a cutthroat world where even a friend could be the killer or the last witness to a perfectly planned execution. Mike Wolfe went from being Frank Fritz's friend to suspect. For over a decade, Mike Wolfe and Fritz were like two sides of the same coin on American Pickers. Mike was the show's outgoing, fast, talking media face, and Frank was its more grounded, detail-oriented half. Frank was often in charge of figuring out the historical and monetary value of the finds. From 2010 to 2020, the pair were a mainstay of American reality TV, traveling the countryside from the Midwest to the Deep South in search of forgotten junk with hidden value. They didn't just make a successful reality show, they made a brand that millions of people loved. But what happened off camera was not what viewers were led to believe. According to several members of the production crew, problems between Frank and Mike started to show around 2018 when Frank's health started getting worse because of complications from Crohn's disease and alcoholism. Frank started missing shoots more often, which made Mike do more of the work on screen. As production pressure rose, so did scrutiny of their pay difference. Several sources say Mike started talking with producers about restructuring the show. In order to get ready for a solo host format, backstage tensions rose. Staff said that Mike became colder toward Frank, talked to him less, and often blamed him when ratings were low. Everything stayed behind closed doors until Frank quietly quit the show in 2020 without giving a formal reason. In public, Mike shared sad posts and expressed grief, but Frank stayed strangely quiet. In a short interview with his son after leaving, Frank said only, "I didn't leave the show." That statement sounds like a scary preview of what was to come after Frank's death. Mike Wolfe didn't act like a friend who was grieving. He was back at the production office just a few days later holding meetings about continuing the show. An anonymous staff member told the FBI, "Mike didn't cry. He just wanted to know if we had scripts ready for the new season and whether the audience would accept the format without Frank." It looked like Mike had already planned his life without his longtime partner, Frank, as he quickly made financial decisions and renegotiated image rights and ad contracts. But the most suspicious information came from Mike Wolfe's text messages and emails, which the FBI obtained from his phone and computer. In one message to a producer just 48 hours before Frank was hospitalized, Mike wrote, "It's time I handle everything. Frank's done his part, now it's my turn." In a legal sense, those words could be seen as self-motivation, but they strongly suggest planning ahead. Another email sent to a Canadian television distributor was called New Project American Pickers 2.0, and it attached a production plan for a new season without Frank Fritz. The date of the email was just 10 days before Frank's death. The FBI used these documents as proof of intent and strategic planning to take over the franchise. But what turned Mike from a witness to the main suspect was the physical. Mike's fingerprints were found on 2 bottles of pills that contained the poisons that killed Frank. Mike said he had helped Frank with his medications days before, but forensic analysis showed that the fingerprints were on the pills less than 48 hours before Frank died. During a second round of questioning by the FBI, Mike's tone changed. He stopped denying guilt and started pointing the finger at outside forces and someone more powerful. After almost 6 hours of questioning, Mike finally dropped a bombshell. Rick Harrison is the boss behind porn stars and has shady business ties to both Mike and Frank. According to Mike's statement, Rick Harrison had approached him privately several times at reality TV events with a plan to get Frank out of the picture so that American pickers and porn stars could restructure their brand partnerships. In an email sent to the court by Mike, Rick allegedly wrote, "Mike, if you want to stay on top, don't let Frank's weakness drag down the empire you built. Take action, I've got it." That one claim changed the whole course of the case. Mike Wolfe, who was originally the main suspect, was now trying to shift the focus to someone even more powerful. Some saw this as an attempt to avoid responsibility, but others, especially criminal analysts, thought it could be a sign of a bigger plot or even a mastermind behind it all. Rick Harrison. This is because Rick stood to gain financially from Mike's sole control of American Pickers through licensing deals, merchandise spin-offs, and a joint venture. Legally, this turn of events put Mike Wolfe in a tough spot. If he did poison Frank, the physical evidence is strong. But if he was just the go-between in someone else's plan, specifically Rick Harrison's, then the real reason for Frank's death becomes much more complicated. That's why the FBI expanded their investigation to include financial records, business partnerships, and communication logs between these 2 reality TV stars. From a beloved star to a man painted as both people quickly saw Mike Wolfe as a possible pawn in a financial power play to kill Frank Fritz. As the news spread, people started to wonder if Frank's death was just the tip of the iceberg in a world where fame, money, and power can turn anyone into a killer. Rick Harrison's role was revealed when Mike Wolfe first named Rick Harrison in the interrogation room as someone who had a big impact on Frank Fritz's death. Many news outlets and politicians reported on this story. People knew Rick Harrison as a sharp but friendly businessman. He was best known for being the star of Porn Stars, one of the most popular reality shows of all time, which ran for over 20 seasons. With his calm, knowledgeable, and approachable personality, Rick wasn't seen as suspect. But what really made this case disturbing was how slowly evidence started to show that Rick Harrison wasn't the outsider he said he was. Mike Wolfe and Rick Harrison had always had close business ties. Since 2015, they worked together on projects like licensing souvenir chains' images and branding old goods. In a number of private deals, Rick put money into American Pickers spin-offs to expand the show's commercial reach. These deals were never made public and were carried out in secret through private investment funds and shell companies. It was important for Rick that he didn't have full control over these investments as long as Frank Fritz, founder and partial rights holder, was still alive. After Mike Wolfe's statement, the FBI looked at all of Rick and Mike's emails, texts, and financial transactions from the 18 months before Frank's death. One email thread from December 2000, just 4 weeks before Frank was hospitalized, stood out. In it, Rick wrote, "Frank is slowing everything down. Time won't wait, Mike. Without you at the wheel, it all falls apart. I'm ready. When you're ready to act, I'll back you all the way." The message wasn't clear. It didn't say anything directly about wrongdoing. However, it was heavy on the accusation. Similar messages showed up a lot between October and January, which was the same time that Frank's health was getting worse and he stopped going to public events. What was even scarier were a series of money transfers from Rick's company, Harrison Holdings, to an account linked to Wolfe Media, the owner of American Pickers. Each transfer was only for tens of thousands of dollars, but the memo lines raised red flags. Strategic brand consulting support for long-term restructuring. Even though these payments weren't illegal in and of themselves, they suggested that Rick would benefit financially if Fritz left the franchise. What raised even more suspicions was Rick's complete silence after Frank's death. He had been seen with Frank at public trade events before, but it wasn't until media speculation grew that Rick, through his attorney, released a short statement saying he had nothing to do with Fritz's death and that all the accusations were false. But the FBI, there were 5 phone calls between Rick and Mike Wolfe in the 24 hours after Frank's death, but they were all private and encrypted. A second important witness, Rick's former business assistant Robert Harris, came forward during a 3-hour deposition and said that Rick had openly talked about buying a stake in American Pickers if Frank quit. Rick didn't say how Frank would leave, but Robert said he was sure it would happen in the first quarter of FBI. Analysts say this statement showed a planned business strategy, something that wouldn't have existed if Frank hadn't been planned to be fired. Even more damning was an internal email from Rick to his legal counsel, in which he asked about options for accessing American Pickers' content rights in the event a partner loses operational capacity. This is legal language that is usually used in cases of death or incapacitation. The email was dated January 6, 2021, just 5 days before Frank died. Rick Harrison had a lot to lose and even more to gain. While still on air, porn stars had been losing viewers since 2018. A merged brand alliance with American Pickers, especially one fully controlled by Mike Wolfe, would allow Rick to reach a larger audience, maximize licensing deals, and start a new empire in the antique reality genre. Frank, who valued authenticity and opposed too much commercialization, was the last obstacle. At the same time, Rick was also a leaked internal financial report from his company showed that he owed over $1.2 million for the failed expansion of Las Vegas's Porn Plaza shopping complex. Rick's way of getting his finances and brand back on track was to strengthen his ties with Wolfe Media. According to a consulting expert whose testimony is in the case files, piece by piece the puzzle started to form a clear picture of how Mike Wolfe, who was under pressure from ratings and his own finances, was pushed, guided, and financially incentivized by Rick Harrison to restructure the brand. Fritz's disappearance wasn't an accident. Rick planned it from behind the scenes. Every move was veiled in the guise of business strategy, but at its core, it was a cruel choice to end a life that wasn't worth living. Investigators no longer see Rick Harrison as a smart businessman. They see him as a central figure in one of the most shocking criminal cases in reality TV history. And if more evidence keeps pointing to his involvement in this plot, not only is his career at stake, but so is his freedom. The FBI investigation began when the official toxicology report confirmed that Fritz had died from being poisoned by a controlled pharmaceutical compound. At that point, the Federal Bureau of Investigation (FBI) officially stepped in at the request of Iowa state authorities. The death of a TV personality was no longer a sudden event. It had become a federal criminal case involving a suspected premeditated murder conspiracy and a large-scale financial motive. In their first week on the case, the FBI started a 3-pronged investigation. They reconstructed the timelines of everyone who had close contact with Frank in the 2 weeks before his death. They did a digital forensic sweep of all communication devices and financial accounts, and they looked at all transactions related to the ownership and intellectual property of American Pickers, which was likely a motive for the crime. Security camera footage from Frank's neighborhood confirmed that Mike Wolfe had visited Frank's house 3 times in the last week of his life, including the last dinner they shared. Notably, none of these visits were recorded on the official filming schedule, which is standard practice for anyone working on the show. All visits were unannounced and happened in the evening. During the last visit, Mike stayed for over an hour and 20 minutes, which is about the time that Frank started showing signs of poisoning. The FBI also looked at Mike Wolfe's car's GPS data to confirm his travels. Mike's personal phone, which was taken under a search warrant, had some text messages that had been partially deleted. These included several conversations with Rick Harrison that happened before Frank's hospitalization night. In one of the messages that was recovered, Rick wrote, "You're too close to turn back now. Mike, don't lose your nerve, end it clean, so you can start fresh." The message was sent at 10:37 p.m., just hours before Frank was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. At the same time, investigators found a 3-minute voice recording that had been saved automatically on Frank Fritz's phone because he had set it up to record important calls with producers. In it, Frank told a family member, "I don't feel safe around Mike anymore. He's been saying weird things like he wants me gone. Rick's up to something too. I don't know who I can trust." It was the first direct evidence. According to more than just digital evidence, the FBI looked into Rick Harrison's and Mike Wolfe's finances and found a number of strange transfers through multiple shell corporations. For example, $75,000 was sent from Harrison Holdings to MW Creative Ventures LLC, which was labeled as a TV product development fund, but forensic financial analysts confirmed that this was not a normal investment. The money was wired just 5 days before the investigation began. The FBI also found that Rick had told his lawyers to write up contingency clauses about American Pickers' image exploitation rights in case of executive-level personnel changes. Phrases like these are usually only used in cases of death, legal incapacitation, or forced resignation. So why was Rick preparing the legal groundwork as if he already knew Frank wouldn't be around? Along with behavioral analysis, the FBI focused on personal motive, which is a key factor in determining whether someone commits a crime. Mike Wolfe's finances were not stable. He had a lot of debt from expanding his antique archaeology store chain and a number of failed investments. By late 2020, he was about to go bankrupt. If Mike had full control over American Pickers, he wouldn't have to share profits or decisions with Frank. This would have helped him restructure his finances, get commercial licensing deals, and negotiate with History Channel without Frank's input. Rick Harrison was also under a lot of pressure. Reports from an independent audit firm said that Rick had a lot of long-term debt from failed real estate deals and poorly running businesses in Las Vegas. Las Vegas porn stars had reached a plateau in viewership, and a brand alliance with American Pickers, which had a similarly devoted fan base, would be a lifeline. But such a partnership could only happen if Frank Fritz, who was against over-commercialization and had the power to veto new contracts, was no longer involved. This is why the FBI started to treat the case as a Rick was the financial backer and strategic planner of the plot, and Mike was the direct executive. The investigation is still going on, but the prosecution has already given the grand jury a lot of evidence, including fingerprints on poison pills, digital records, texts, emails, GPS logs, and the financial motivations of both suspects. A former FBI agent told 60 Minutes that this case is a clear reminder that white-collar crime, especially on reality TV, isn't just about fraud or tax evasion. It can turn into murder when, even though there isn't a final verdict yet, the case has already made people rethink how they look up to TV stars. Mike Wolfe isn't the happy picker who wanders rural back roads anymore, and Rick Harrison isn't the wisecracking boss of a porn shop. Both are now under the scrutiny of federal law and facing the most important question of their lives. Could fame, money, or fear of losing power drive someone to kill Mike Wolfe? The case against Rick Harrison says that these things happen. Harrison, in June 2012, the federal courthouse in Des Moines, Iowa, became the center of a trial that had never been seen before in reality TV history. Mike Wolfe, the founder and star of American Pickers, was charged with first-degree murder in the death of his longtime partner Frank Fritz. What made the trial so famous was Mike Wolfe's claim in court that Rick Harrison wasn't just involved, he was the mastermind. From the first hearing, Mike Wolfe's defense team was a powerhouse. A Chicago law firm built their case on two main points. They denied that Mike directly killed Frank and pointed the finger at Rick Harrison as the mastermind behind the plot. In opening statements, Mike's main lawyer told the jury, "My client was manipulated. He didn't kill his friend, but he was led, enticed, and cornered into an impossible position by one man, Rick Harrison, the true puppeteer behind this tragedy." Prosecutors, on the other hand, said that Mike had motive, means, and direct. The case became more complicated when Rick Harrison was added to the story. Prosecutors had to separate the main characters from the secondary ones and figure out who killed Frank. The trial lasted several weeks and had dozens of witnesses and forensic experts. The turning point came in week 3 when Mike Wolfe took the stand in his own defense, which is unusual in first-degree murder trials. Mike, dressed in a plain gray suit, spoke in a low, shaking voice about a decade-long relationship with Frank. Friendship with Frank that included road trips, fights, and a dark time when Frank started to get worse. "I never thought I'd be sitting here," Mike said, "but I can't stay silent when I know who really pulled the strings." The defense then showed a series of emails and encrypted messages that had never been seen before. One email from Rick Harrison to Mike just 48 hours after a meeting behind closed doors in Las Vegas said, "If you want to move forward, you have to be willing to sacrifice. We can't carry that rotting legacy any longer." Mike said Rick called Frank, whom he saw as a financial, emotional, and strategic drag. In another message, Rick said, "I'll handle the legal side. You just make sure Frank steps out of the picture, and I'll take care of the rest." While Rick's lawyers were in court, they said the texts were taken out of context. However, FBI digital forensics confirmed that the messages were real, time-stamped, and GPS synced. The defense also played a never-before-heard audio recording of a phone call between Mike and Rick that was made 3 days after Frank was confirmed dead. Rick's voice was low and cold. "This will all blow over soon. The press will move on. The audience will adapt. What matters now is that you seize the moment. I told you to follow the tone and timing of Mike's testimony." Along with a draft licensing agreement for American Pickers made by Rick Harrison that left Frank's name out of the ownership structure, were also very important. The draft was dated 2 weeks before Frank died. "I couldn't bring myself to sign it," Mike said, his voice breaking, "but Rick told me that if I didn't I'd lose everything, and if Frank was still alive he'd block it." Prosecutors wouldn't let Mike shift blame, though, so they easily won by showing that Mike's fingerprints were found on the medicine bottles that contained the poison that killed Frank. Mike admitted that he had handled the bottles while helping to clean Frank's medicine cabinet, but he couldn't explain why his prints were found on the two that specifically contained toxins. The defense changed its story again, saying that Rick was the one who sent the fake bottles through a third-party courier while Mike was an unwitting participant. They even showed a copy of a pharmaceutical order placed through a Nevada-based distributor with payment traced to a Harrison Holdings subsidiary. The order included compounds that matched those found in Frank's body. Rick Harrison, who had not been officially charged yet, stayed silent and did not show up in court, but the pressure was building. From being a side character in Mike's testimony, Rick's name was being pushed to the forefront as the alleged mastermind. The media was filled with questions about why Rick was accused of murder. He had cancelled all public appearances, pulled out of events, and closed down several Porn Plaza stores during this time. The trial reached its most dramatic point when Susan Thompson, who had been at Frank and Mike's last dinner together, went on the stand and said that Rick had video called Mike that same night. "I could clearly hear Rick saying, 'Don't forget why you're doing this. Frank is the past, the future is yours.'" The statement was the last straw for Rick Harrison's public image. The trial wasn't over yet, but it was clear that Mike Wolfe wasn't alone in the dock. The emails, audio recordings, invoices, and testimonies that he presented not only took some of the legal weight off of him, but they also turned the case into a bigger investigation into Rick Harrison and his companies, which were connected to him in a bad reality TV ecosystem. After weeks of testimony, debate, and exposure, what emerged wasn't just a murder case. It was the end of a TV system that people used to think was real. The case of Mike Wolfe, who was accused of killing Frank Fritz, and Rick Harrison, who was thought to be the mastermind, affected more than just one person. It destroyed trust in the whole reality TV industry. Reality TV started out as a fun alternative to scripted boredom. Viewers found comfort in shows like Survivor, Dating, American Pickers, and Porn Stars, but as the industry grew, so did its dark side. The pressure of fame and the desire to make money turned friends into rivals and sometimes into killers. Frank Fritz's case is proof of this. Frank went from being a normal guy to a household name, but as the show's popularity peaked, his declining health was no longer seen as a liability. But as a liability, Mike Wolfe, his longtime partner, went from being a friend to an alleged accomplice, Rick Harrison, once and no one said it out loud, but everyone knew reality TV wasn't real anymore. Behind the smiles, banter, and bearing were scripts, contracts, performance quotas, and cruel brand strategies. Frank wasn't the first person to be kicked off a show for being bad for business, but he may have been the first person to die directly because of being kicked off. The scandal also brought up serious questions about the networks and production companies. Companies that supported this environment, especially History Channel, which oversaw both American Pickers and Porn Stars. Why did people like Rick and Mike have almost complete control over content and merchandise? Why wasn't there an independent system to flag questionable financial ties? How could a clearly sick man like Frank keep being pushed on screen, even though he was showing clear signs of physical and mental decline? After the initial shock, the media started to dig deeper. Variety called it reality TV Watergate, The Atlantic What's Real Anymore, and Rolling Stone didn't hold back. If what Mike said is true, Rick Harrison isn't just a porn shop either. To be fair, the audience isn't completely innocent either. Viewers make the demand for drama, shock, and surprise twists, and they decide which shows get a love or die rating. When producers run out of fake conflict, real people, real friendships, and real lives become props in an unplanned tragedy. When Frank made his last appearances on American Pickers, it was painfully clear that something was wrong. Mike's tense face, choppy conversations, and the strange emotional distance between two men who were once seen as brothers were all signs that something wasn't right. But viewers were too interested, too entertained, and too willing to believe everything was okay that by the time the truth came out, trust, not just a man, had been lost forever. The Frank Fritz case is a wake-up call for the global reality TV industry, from South Korea to the UK, from cable giants to, for local Vietnamese broadcasters. The trend of putting image over integrity is no longer a secret. But now that there is a criminal case shaking the genre to its core, the industry has to ask where the line is and who sets it. The audience, the law, or the conscience of those behind the camera. What started out as a seemingly natural death has turned into a web of lies driven by money, ambition, and deep-seated doubts about one's career relevance. Friends turned into enemies and allegiances fell apart. No matter what the court decides or whether Rick Harrison is officially charged or not, one truth can no longer be hidden. In reality TV, fame can come with a deadly price. Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to get the latest news on this shocking case. The truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how deeply it is buried.